Welcome back, everybody. Thank you once again for being so punctual. This is setting some kind of a world record for conferences of people actually coming back on time. Now we move on to the colourfully labelled topic of It's the Economy, Dumb Eggs. Must be an American that wrote that title. It certainly wasn't me. I'd like to introduce very briefly our moderator today, the Honourable Pamela Wallin, Chair of the Senate National Security and Defence Committee of Canada. Pamela will be moderating this session, but just before I hand over to her, we have, of course, got a video to show you.
Occupy Wall Street, which is no longer confined to New York's financial district, has spawned copycat protests across the U.S., Europe, and even the Middle East.
The Tottenham district of North London looks more like a war zone.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Robin, for the introduction. So yes, the title of our panel is It's the Economy, Dumb Eggs, bracket, stupid. And the subtitle is It's the Spending, Stupid. We are going to try and look at the big macroeconomic picture here. Are we really facing, I'm going to present some dramatic options here, but is it the end of the American empire? Is the EU dead? Is, as the IMF has posed, this is now the lost decade, and that we might be seeing civil war break out across very different countries as a result of growing inequities? The result of the U.S. Super Committee and its task to cut, will they meet their deadline next week? What about the David Cameron and Chancellor Merkel meeting? Lots of smiles. Not much agreement. So economic crisis, will it equal political instability? If spending must be cut, as we all agree it must, what does that mean? Will we be able to defend ourselves and provide the kind of security that we need? We have an amazing panel with us today. Let me introduce our first guest, Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, distinguished statesman for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, former German defense minister. James Hogue is with us, chairman of the Human Rights Watch, former editor for many, many years of Foreign Affairs magazine. Welcome. And also joining us, Alan Mendoza, executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, a London-based think tank. So, gentlemen, let's begin, and I want to start with you, Jim, if I could, just on the whole question of the end of the American empire. Are you spending yourself into oblivion? Will the committee actually be able to meet its objective?
Let me start by saying that things could be worse, and as a matter of fact, may get worse very soon. And in part, that's an answer to your question. One thing that a crisis develops is the fissures that maybe aren't that apparent before the crisis comes. It's quite clear now that the European Union, and particularly the Eurozone 17 and 27, have a lot more differences on what to do and how to do it than was apparent. And the trouble with that is that in a crisis like this, delay can be fatal. And we already see that we've run through a series of options as far as dealing with the EU countries' problems. The IMF, individual countries, and so on. And we're left with the cry now, will the central bank print enough money to get us through? Everybody understands that's not a long-term solution. Well, even that is going to be difficult because the Germans, among others, do not think that's a very good idea. As for America, I want to give you a couple of small threads of good news. We have had now repeatedly indications of basic economic indices rising just a little bit, so little that they could easily be turned around. But we're also talking in the United States about it looks like we have avoided a second recession. All of this becomes just talk if what's going on in Europe today continues. Now, as for the super committee that we've got, there is a case to be made, and I won't make it now, I'll make it a little later because I'm going to talk too long otherwise. There is a case to be made that the solution that they can come up with would be so small and misapplied that we're better to pass that, get to the elections, and get to a period of time in which more sober and maybe bolder actions can be taken on the economic front.
I just want to see if your glass is half full there. It sounds like it, like it is. But your view is you've got enough time before the vote in 2012 and enough maneuvers that can be made that there will be no fatal crisis before the vote.
That's maybe a little overstating where I am. What I'm saying is that up until now, with the committee meeting and the EU trying to figure out how to handle its debt problems, the United States has been improving very modestly. That can all come a cropper, both because of what's going on in our country, but also what's going on in Europe. I'm not predicting it, but I'm saying that's one of the risks we're running.
Karl Theodor, the pages of the newspapers today, the smiling pictures of David Cameron and Chancellor Merkel pledging their friendship, but agreeing to very little. What does that mean in response to what Jim has said? Is the EU actually dead?
Let me start by saying it actually can't get worse. But maybe it can. It's from yesterday's meeting, or taking this into account, at least they smiled. That's already something very positive. In substance, there was very little, you're right. And it showed again the foremath and the aftermath of the meeting yesterday, that we have on one hand the UK and a group of others that actually ask for a European Union that's not the ever closer union, but an ever looser union. And we still have a couple of countries that ask for an ever closer union. So it was a meeting, at least yesterday, but I didn't sense much substance. So looking at the European crisis right now, it's not only a euro crisis, it's not only a debt crisis, it certainly is. It's first and foremost a crisis of understanding. It's a crisis, and if you say it's a crisis of understanding, you do have a crisis of political leadership as well. So that's one of the things we have to resolve. And if you ask a German at the very moment whether he could describe to you what kind of crisis this is, you have about 3 different answers you can get. If you're an American, he will tell you, mind your own business, because all evil more or less comes from the United States. If he's a little bit more polite, but it's not a matter of politeness, he looks to Southern Europe and complains about the laziness over there and other things. But most of the time you get an answer that the Germans will just shrug their shoulders because they don't have a clue, an idea how the European Union functions, how this crisis has evolved, what this crisis actually means. And that's a matter of crisis of understanding. It's just not explained thoroughly to the German public and to others in the European Union. So that's also a part which we have to see. So taking this into account now brings me to the point that there is a long, long way to go. We might find solutions on the short term now, but when it comes to the long-term solutions, I'm honestly very pessimistic looking at the current state of the European Union, looking at the structure of the European Union. There's no intellectual, creative approach towards a long-term solution how the European Union could look like.
And proof, as many have said, that you can't have a monetary union with without some kind of political structure, and it's just never been there, and now the chickens are coming home to roost.
Absolutely. No, it's and of course there were a couple of famous Germans who said that and who tried to push that forward. But we come to the edges now, and we will see how the whole thing develops. Looking closely at Spain right now, we do have an election over there, right? It's tomorrow, and it may tame the situation for a couple of days, but probably just for a couple of days. We do have some more states that will struggle for their AAA rating. There are rumors about Finland, about Austria, about the Netherlands right now how it may develop. Not talking about France at the very moment. Everybody's trembling there right now how this will develop. So again, we are somehow in a political phase where we stumble from ad hoc solution to ad hoc solution, but nothing in the long term.
Alan, I know you're not much more optimistic about the problems in Europe, also stateside. Why don't you just give us your view in terms of what you've heard here?
Well, I think far be it for me to break the consensus here. It is indeed a case of extreme pessimism. You're going to come out in here, be so depressed you won't even be able to have lunch. But on a serious note, look, I think it's profoundly ironic. We heard at the end of the last session, the moderator closed with the words, you know, it's been said that the Arab Spring, where we're at now, we're at the end of the first act of a 5-act play. It sort of applies where we are here now in both Europe and America. I think, to come back for a second on the American case, I think yes, there's obviously moves to look at things right now. You might be able to hold out until the election. But what worries me about America is that there's no fundamental political agreement about the basic necessity of the balancing the budget. We know it has to be done, but one side don't think that raising taxes is impossible. The other side says that cutting entitlements is very difficult. The two sides are so far apart that I'm worried about
an election is necessary.
Perhaps, but that election, of course, may not yield the result you want. You may indeed have split control of the executive and legislative branches. So it's problematic there. On the European side, we've seen in the last week. I quite agree with the characterisation that at least they smiled in this sort of picture yesterday. I don't know if you've been following this. In the last week, British and German tabloids have been absolutely kicking each other down. I mean, we've seen some really nasty headlines across the way. I think it was a real danger. This could have spilled over into serious sort of xenophobic attitudes beyond. And I think at least that has been allayed right now. But going forward, there's no answers. What we are seeing is an agreement to disagree. We don't have an answer on whether the ECB should be the lender of last resort. We don't know if the European Union or 17 countries within it are going to impose a Financial Transactions Act. We don't have a clue how that's going to proceed. And until our leaders start developing the political courage to actually come to fair solutions, and I think the German role will be critical in this. There's a critical pivot between those who might wish to have more Europe or less Europe, but to try and strike a reasonable compromise. I think we're going to continue to struggle to find those solutions.
Please indicate if you're interested in participating in this debate, and we'll try and get a microphone to you. But I want to put sort of the second tier of this discussion on the record as well, too, which is that very fundamental question as we wrestle with these perhaps lethal economic circumstances. We are all in all of our countries facing massive cuts to government spending, and that means cuts to defense spending, and then that begs the question, with all of the instability that we're seeing out there, in part provoked by the economic instability, will we then have the measures to deal with it if we start to make those cuts? Do you want to take a crack at that each? And maybe, Carl Theodor, you can begin.
Well,
Should I start?
the Obama administration has ordered cuts in the defense budget, and they are already underway. The big question is that going to be the end of it, or once the super committee gets finished its business one way or another, there'll be even larger cuts. At that level, I think there's real cause to worry about hollowing out the military. But the cuts that are being worked on now look to me, at least, as if they are manageable, that they will not fatally undermine America's ability to have force projection, to have a global position. But along with that is a switch in foreign policy, which I think is critical to understand, and that is we are gun-shy now of further engagements of the kind we've just gotten, well, we're not quite through with yet, very gun-shy. And there's a lot of emphasis, starting with the President and with the Secretary of State, and you heard from Leon Panetta, so it's pretty uniform, that we've got to build up our capabilities for development aid, for diplomatic resolutions, for getting allies and others, regional groups, to cooperate more in some of the things that need to be done in the name of security. Now, this is not the most pleasant answer, I guess, but it also, to me, says that we don't have quite the crisis that some people think we do.
Just a comment from Carl Theodor on this. Former defense minister, you know what this would mean if we see cuts.
Well, the cuts are a reality in Germany as well, but the positive outcome of it is that it led us to reforms, finally, in an archaically structured armed forces in Germany. So the good news is it gave us enough reason for a reform which is directed to professionalize the armed forces. And maybe another, let's say, positive outcome of the whole discussion we are in is that the European Union or the member states of the European Union are finally somehow forced not only to speak about coherence, not only to speak about connecting their deficits and the things they have to offer, but finally to come to a solution. And we try that with the Ghent initiative we have started. It's still in its child's shoes. It didn't move forward that much, but I think it's a good starting point. So under those circumstances, I think we can be quite positive. I'm much more worried about the shrinking aspects of official development assistance. I think this is one of the things where we really have to keep in mind, because you cannot talk about economic risk while not linking it to the risks that may evolve out of that, specifically when it comes to development aid and other things.
Question here, if you can identify yourself.
Yeah. François Géret from France. My question is related to the consequences of that crisis in terms of balance of power. And my sense is that we are in a very, very ambiguous period where Europeans and, to some extent, the United States as well, as are looking at Asia and particularly at China. The Europeans at the G20 made clear that they need probably some help from the Chinese government, which has a tremendous capital capability. And that's not that obvious. At the same time, we see the United States saying publicly, you have noted the speech by Secretary Clinton, that Asia was increasingly important in the balance of not only power, but also interest of the United States. How do you evaluate the consequences and the magnitude of that suggested shift? Is it temporary? Is it a long trend? And what are the consequences for the relationship between Europe and the United States? Thank you.
The new emphasis, if you will, on Asia as a priority in American foreign policy is, to many critics, including me, belated. It should have happened sooner. Asia, not for next year, not for next month, but for a long time, is going to be the center of global politics and foreign policy interests and risks, if you will, big risks that have to be addressed early if they're to be avoided. Now, the American position is that as we cut back some of our other expenses, including defense, not all of that money is going to go to the bottom line. Some of it is going to be reapplied. We are also trying to reform our military to make it more flexible, more elite units, less heavy weaponry and the rest of it, for what are the challenges of today. As far as China is concerned, we have really had a fairly consistent policy. It's twofold. The first is engage them. Do not presuppose that they're going to be a conflictual adversary forever. There are going to be differences, yes, they're on the rise, and people on the rise want more of the cake than they had before. But that it is a doable game as far as we can see at the moment. However, the second tier, which is less identified and ought to be less identified, is we're trying to position ourselves in case things do go awry. So we're building up our alliances in Asia. We have just got a new one, a new arrangement with Australia to put 25,000 troops, 2,500 troops over there. And I think the combination of these two is the right way to go in trying to engage China, get China to continue to evolve into the international system, but at the same time have clear warning signals, clear red lines as to what would be behavior that would turn it into a very adversarial situation.
Quick comment from our other two panelists. Alan, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, well, I think it's important to note that nothing is set in stone here. We do know, of course, relatively power is shifting. We know that it's not new. The focus we've had in the last few weeks, months, is merely demonstrative of the trend. We know that. But the question of where we go from here is, of course, in our own destiny. Look, firstly, within the West, if we look at the relationship between Europe and America, what we choose to do as Europeans or Americans will have an impact upon how that goes. If Europe turns in on itself, if it stops spending money on its military, if it loses that leg of what you need to be a global power, you have to have economic power and military power, then the US will quite rightly say, well, we're not interested in Europe anymore. You can kind of decline in terms of what you're doing because you're not willing to make the security role in the world a priority in terms of your policy. So it's simple. Equally in America, if American leaders decide to make the most of the gifts of that particular nation in terms of economic and military might, they can arrest and manage that relative decline quite well. They can balance the movement going forward, looking at China, neither judging yet whether it can be a competitor or indeed a friend as to how that goes forward, or they can take one of those tracks and it will lead to reactions. It really is the matter, people discuss this as if it's sort of set in stone, it's all over, we're just hand-wringing in general. We still have a tremendous control over our own destiny here, and we should take advantage of that.
Would that imply that NATO would be dead?
No, I do think NATO is dead unless, again, we choose to kill it. Simple.
I think that Europe slept for quite a while when it comes to the question whether they realized, yes or no, that their trans-Pacific relationship is growing. And the shift of power, of course, is obvious for many years now. But from a European perspective, we didn't have it on our screen. And looking at the transatlantic relationship, I think it really has impacts. It's definitely not enough just to look romantically over the Atlantic and to think that everything is still carved in stone as it used to be. It certainly isn't. We do have a new administration in the United States that is focused much more over the Pacific than actually over the Atlantic at the very moment. And that's one of the things Europeans have to keep in mind as well. And it's certainly not enough just to complain about it, but to look for and to seek the substantial questions, whether we could resolve them yes or no over the Atlantic, yes or no as well, or if we at least have a policy in Europe as well towards the Asian states, maybe to China as well. So there is, I don't see very much at the very moment, and I think it's high time to start to find a dialogue as well.
Dr. Stein. Just a sec, we're going to get your mic working, and please introduce yourself.
Sorry, Janice Stein from the Monk School of Global Affairs. Following on your three comments about leadership, let me add that all politics is local. And I just came back from a visit to Berlin, where all we heard really was the unforgiving politics in Germany around a view of European institutions that would make the European Central Bank, for example, a lender of last resort. So how unforgiving are the politics to allow the kind of leadership that you're talking about to emerge?
I think that an important point has been made already. Paul, you said there's a necessity and urgency to find a compromise, and leadership also leads to compromises, not only once in a while, but usually. And looking at Germany at the very moment, I think many are asking for that kind of leadership to find a compromise, and not only to smile after meeting with Dave Cameron yesterday. And it's probably the hardest part to bring those ends together, the Cameron end and the Angela Merkel end, in that very spectrum we're in right now. One has to understand the German behavior right now. It's, of course, it's always a German behavior to point at the rules and to say this is not possible to have the ECB as a last resort in that very way. This is that's what we love to do. It's to say it's not allowed. And secondly, of course, one has to keep in mind as well that there is a long-time German fear when it comes to the question of inflation, whether that's true or not, but that has to be resolved, that very question. And as soon as we touch upon the ECB, the inflation question is at least obvious, and we need clear answers regarding that. But nevertheless, the alternatives that I've heard so far, maybe from Berlin or from other sides, are not convincing as well. And so we definitely need to find a compromise here. Not knowing yet where this will lead to. And it's not only a question of the 17, it's a question of the 27, probably even more.
Gentleman right here.
Christoph von Marschall from the German Daily Tagesspiegel. I'm living in the US, but I happened also to visit Berlin and Hamburg in recent days. And from the other side of the Atlantic, this whole situation looks quite different. And please just allow me to make the devil's argument in a few points why it looks different. First of all, German bankers I met in Hamburg would tell me, well, the debt to GDP ratio of the US is already today worse than that of the Eurozone. And if the debt committee is not acting, then in 2013 it will be even worse by a far higher degree. So why everybody says the Eurozone is the only and biggest threat to world economy, and how do the Americans manage to get somehow out of the picture of crisis? That's very good PR, but maybe not what's reality. Second, why is ambiguity, what the Eurozone is going to do, a sign of weakness or lack of leadership? Is it not part of the solution? If you would tell in the first act how the fifth act will play out, it's not only bad from the view of the guy who writes the piece, it would be also too easy for markets and for everybody else. We need to be ambiguous in order that those who have to make their homework have the pressure to do their homework. If you tell them today the EZB will bail you out in 5 years from now, so it doesn't work. So should we really look at this ambiguity as a sign of weakness, not leadership, or is it part of the solution and not just part of the problem? Cameron, Merkel, of course nothing could come out. I mean, GB is not part of the Eurozone. They can't help anything when we talk about the current Euro crisis. We need to get an agreement what happens in the third or the fourth act, whether we have to change the treaties in order that the ECB can play such a role or not. If you don't change the treaties, they are not allowed to do that, what you all are asking for. And the last point, we have this disagreement where we have to go. The US has a problem with the Great Depression, so they want to spend to get out of the crisis. Europeans have the inflation, Karl Theodor just mentioned that, so we don't want to spend, we want to cut in order not to run into an inflation crisis. Yeah, there's agreement to disagreement, but is it also bad, or is it not part of the normal process and even part rather of the solution than of the problem?
All right, thank you very much. Alan, why don't you start, and Jim can be contemplating his answer.
Okay, well, there's so much there, and we can take, different parts of it. Let's look at this issue of ambiguity. Yes, of course you don't want to give the game away, but I suspect we're not even playing the same game at the moment within Europe. That's part of the problem. We're talking at cross purposes in terms of where we'd like to go and go forward. And one thing we've seen in the Eurozone crisis is that, of course, the markets are thriving on, or rather reacting to uncertainty. You have to give the market some certainty of knowing where they're going to be in order to stop attack on attack on attack on each of the Eurozone countries. And that's why you've seen the focus move on and on and on. You sort one issue out, it moves to the next country. You go on and you continue. The problem being there's no global solution that's going to solve the Eurozone issue. And this, I think, is a reason why it's so toxic globally as well, because you have the situation where you've got 17 countries where this could go, and it's interesting to note that, of course, the German economy is in a much better shape than any of the others, but even there, it's interesting to see what the reaction was if anyone was following the bond yield prices on Thursday and Friday, that the Germans were suffering somewhat in relation to the UK-US treasuries in terms of people buying. So there's clearly a confidence issue that's going right across the Eurozone that's problematic. And again, you're quite right, the Americans are not, potentially a much bigger problem in 2012, 2013, but debt to GDP ratio is but one measure that we're looking at in terms of confidence. The markets have confidence, I suppose, ultimately in America because they know the growth will be there in America to get out of it and to pay the debt. The problem some of the European countries, and you saw this most recently with Italy, of course, is that there is no confidence that the growth will be there to get out of it. And that is an issue that Eurozone is going to have to look at and deal with as well. So once again, I think ambiguity is fine to a point, but you have to start delivering some answers in order to reassure the markets and ensure that things don't get worse.
Jim?
Just a quick word to start on NATO. To state the obvious, NATO has been a very important transatlantic political organization as well as a security one. And I think that's fully understood in the United States. We do not want to see NATO fade away or die. There has to be some rethinking about what it's going to be for and what the boundaries of activity are going to be and so on. But that's an organizational problem that I think can be handled. On the U.S. and spending, the argument is when to cut spending, not so much that spending has to be cut. There's pretty uniform feeling that that's got to be done. But we do think, at least some of us, that the timeline is not quite as urgent as other people think, that the American economy is very strong, that what we need to do first is to reignite parts of the economy which are kind of dead right now, like employment, and let the world and our citizenry know what the plans are for cuts in the out years. Things will not be that bad in 2012 and 2013. First of all, the Bush tax cuts, unless something is done, they're gone. That's $1 billion plus. And the automatic cuts that will come. So spending is not going to continue the way it is right now. The big question for us is, and this is where our politics is so dysfunctional at the moment, which is when do you do these things? If you cut to the extent that conservatives want in the United States right now, the fear is that you are going to bring on a second and very probably bigger recession, and that will not only affect us, it's going to affect everybody else.
Should have gone for that job-creating pipeline, another topic. How about the German living in Washington and your view on the gentleman's assertion?
It's just lovely to look to Europe from the United States perspective at the moment and to learn about Berlin. No, but I agree with the stock taking of Christopher Marshall. I think that's definitely right what he says about German perspective and perception of the whole thing. And I'm not quite sure whether your solution would lead to a, let's say, more flexible, let's call it a more flexible ECB, would lead to the solution we actually are seeking for. I think it's much more of a short-term solution that we will see then. But after a while, we will be coming back to the main issue you've just mentioned, that we need pressure on certain member states to at least come to certain austerity measures or other things. And that wouldn't and won't happen otherwise. And this is where we are somehow in a vicious circle right now. If we start asking for the ECB again and again, we won't find the solution.
Right, question here.
Mark Cameron from Ottawa. It's interesting that in this discussion, one of the presuppositions is that it's time to reduce spending and that austerity and restraint are underway. Yet this is an issue that's clearly in great debate. You have governments like David Cameron's that are pursuing an austerity agenda, Canada to a lesser extent, Germany, but other governments like the United States, where there's still, at least at the administration level, a desire for massive fiscal and monetary stimulus. And I mean, you raised the question of timing. Clearly, with the debt to GDP and deficit to GDP ratios that all these countries have, cuts have to come eventually. But politically, both within Europe, with the different perspectives of all the European countries, and in the United States with the political gridlock, how do we come to a consensus as to when to turn the taps on and when to turn the taps off?
Anybody got the answer to that? If you do, you should be running for president.
No, I would just say once again, I think we are at a point where, at least in the United States, where the politics is so stymied that it is going to take an election that may not produce an outcome that we like very much, but it does get the ball moving again. My own sense is that after the election of 2012, there'll be a lot more leeway for some consultations, some negotiations on a path forward that involves both cuts over a longer period of time, not all jammed at the beginning, and on some new revenue. We are in an amazing situation in the United States where no matter what the subject is, whether it's entitlements, whether it's education or whatever, there's a very strong body that says we're not going to spend any more money on it. How we maintain our position as a global leader and as a competitor in an increasingly competitive global economy with that kind of an attitude, I don't know. And I don't think it will last. I think an election, while it won't give us a perfect answer, will at least clear the air a bit and get us back to where we can have to concentrate on moving forward because the election's over.
Comment from Carl Taylor, because there is no consensus in Europe on that issue.
And that's also due to the banal and trivial fact that one election day is following the other in Europe. And so if we are in the year 2012, we have the 2013 elections in Germany, and one may or can see how much courage will evolve out of that just in the format of 2013. So I think if we talk about the long-term perspectives as well, we need to find some common ground on certain issues where I don't see any creativity at the very moment. For instance, when it comes to the question, how do we deal with the costs of the demographic development in Europe, specifically in Europe? Taking into account now let's say the age-related liquidity that is needed to tackle with that very challenge it dwarfs, and it really dwarfs the costs we are talking about right now when it comes to stimulus packages and other things. So there's nothing, there is no discussion about that very fact. I don't see much of a discussion over here as well when it comes to the demographic question, and it's still interrelated and intertwined with all the economic crisis aspects we are discussing right now and we're talking about.
Go ahead,
can
quickly.
I bring another
Right.
angle into it as well? We've just had the demographic issue. We've also got the democratic issue as well. I mean, we now have a government in Italy which has no democratic mandate at all. And Greece, which no democratic mandate. How are they going to respond to public pressures when they've not been elected as such to do that? We speak about trying to have a sort of global system where we'll converge in terms of spending cuts and others, but that doesn't take into account the democratic process and the importance of getting buy-in from people into our economic systems. I mean, part of the problem, I think, of the whole Eurozone has been that essentially there was no public approval for this long term. Yes, governments were elected, and it's a question of if we're going to continue down this and we're going to continue down the realm of trying to solve all the problems technocratically, we will run into huge political backlashes. And the last time we saw this happening, the problems, as we know, were in the 1930s. We don't want to go down that route again.
And if someone asks for a referendum, he's getting slapped by a chancellor and by a president. Yeah,
All right, let's try and get some questions here. We have one there, and one here, and then we're going to try and move some microphones around. Go ahead, Ian.
Yes, Ian Brody. I'm a Canadian, currently working in Washington. If it really is the economy dumb eggs, and I think it is, surely it's the global economy dumb eggs. And the dynamic part of the global economy for the last several years has been the South-South economy, not the transatlantic one. It's come into this discussion here because we're searching for a player with enough foreign currency reserves, a big enough bazooka to help us out of our transatlantic problems. But my question is the transatlantic world willing to take the political steps that are needed to reflect the shift of dynamism in the global economy? Is there going to be real change at the IMF or the World Bank or the other international financial institutions? Are we prepared to deal in a responsible way with the emerging powers, given that they may have their own political developments to worry about as well?
Alan, why don't you grab that one?
Well, I think I don't sit at those tables, so I can't tell you the real political will behind there. But look, I think it works both ways. We've had discussions earlier today in the R2P panel about how some of the emerging world is not stepping up to the plate on security issues in the way that we would hope. Responsibility works both ways. If you want some power here, you may have to accept you're going to have to give up some power there in terms of coordinating. And I think we're moving towards slowly some notion of how this integration process is going to work, how we're going to reflect the balance and shift of power. But it's all very well for us to give. We need to receive in that process as well. It isn't going to just be a one-way street.
Question there, Anne-Marie. Go ahead.
Anne-Marie Slaughter, Princeton University. So I'm going to do something you're never supposed to do in situations like this and make a prediction. I'm going to predict that as the German spreads get hit, harmed, it will concentrate Germany's mind. They will, in fact, then support the ECB issuing Eurobonds, and we will, in fact, buy the political space necessary to resolve the crisis. But what I really wanted to do was challenge my good friend Jim Hogue on the relentless Asia focus. The EU is the largest economy in the world. Even if the euro tanks, it will still be the largest economy in the world. And the EU is not going to disappear. The euro could disappear, but the EU is certainly not going to disappear. It's China's largest trading partner. So economically, the EU and the US, you're talking almost $30 trillion of economy, and you're talking the home of Nato, the most powerful fighting force by a mile in the world, capable of deploying hundreds of thousands of soldiers. If you would think of the US and Europe, and this crisis, if anything, should show you how incredibly interlinked we are, as a core, and you spread out democracy and prosperity from the EU and the US toward the Middle East, toward Africa and Latin America, which are also the major growth areas of the coming century, I think you have a more accurate and certainly a more positive vision.
Jim?
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest, and if somebody took it that way, it's a mistake, that these are two mutually exclusive issues. We are deeply tied across the Atlantic, and I think we always will be, both in values and in interests, and the economic issues are fundamental. But I think it's in the interest of both sides of the Atlantic that we get a more vigorous and perhaps more successful relationship with a series of countries in Asia. The economic payoff there for us and for Europe is just huge. I don't see that there's a contradiction in paying more attention to Asia than we have. That's the only point I was making. I think we have not had the resources devoted to that region that we should have had. I don't think we have had the awareness, if you will, and I see it coming along now, and I think that's a plus.
Does it have to be that China's largest trading partner is the EU? Can it not be the combined, you know, the countries of the EU?
Could it be Germany, Finland, Poland, France, and the Netherlands? Maybe, but I'm still optimistic as well when it comes to how the EU, whether the EU will survive, yes or no, and it will survive, and I'm definitely clear about that. But I haven't heard a politician during the last couple of years on both sides of the Atlantic talking with such an emphasis as you just did about the European Union, about the transatlantic partnership. There are no emotions any longer, and they're not reaching out to the public. They're not reaching out to the people and try to somehow embrace them with that very thought. That's one of the things that's missing. It's lacking. It sounds like a simplicity, but it's not happening at the very moment. So that's one of the things we have to keep in mind. We talk about such things. It's a very banal answer I'm giving you right now, but it's part of the truth. If you look over the Atlantic, it is clearly disturbed when it comes to that question. There is no open, clear talk about the possibility, opportunities we still have.
You want to jump in, Al?
Yeah, but this goes to the heart of it. It's about Europe's confidence. Do European leaders have the confidence to embrace that vision that you just articulated, Anne-Marie? I don't think they do at the moment. They used to have some kind of notion of confidence. It hasn't been in evidence for the last 5-6 years. Until they recover that, you're going to have those questions continually being asked, and they need to, come a step forward to say, we remain a great power, great powers in the plural. We remain capable and willing to have an outward role in the world. We're not just going to sit here passively and just be a trading set of nations. We have values to spread. We have prosperity to spread. We even have the capability to intervene militarily, if necessary. But all that stems from the confidence of leaders to stand up and say it, and for the confidence of people to follow them. It's that simple.
It's an identity crisis, by the way.
Let's have a question here and a question. Yeah, actually, you were first. You're quite right. Go ahead, and we'll have the question, and then go to this one and combine them.
Hello? Oh, yes, it does. Vago Moranian from Defense News. Just one parenthetic comment. If you talk to anybody on Wall Street, it's all about perception and expectation. And one of the big reasons why the United States is ahead of everybody else is that they think we stink less for the time being. So it's just a matter of time whether or not the expectation and the perception catch up with us. But more specifically, folks in the United States are talking about obviously very significant defense budget cuts, may go well beyond $450 billion for all we know. And folks were saying, hey, 7 decades after the end of World War II, we still have tens of thousands of troops based in Europe, and that we should be pulling them out. What impact would that have on the transatlantic relationship?
Great, good question, and pose yours as well. Thank you.
Charles Everson from Chatham House. Is this on? Yes. The crisis, the economic crisis, obviously is current and it's real and it's serious, but I want to ask the panel to reflect on another kind of issue, which is that the crisis outside the West is very much perceived as being made in the West. It's very much branded being made in the West. And in a sense, the operating system that we've had for the global economy, the Western operating system, is now viewed as defunct by many people outside the West. How does the West deal with that changed situation? Thank you.
2 very interesting questions. Quick comment. Who wants to start? Why don't you start, Carl Theodor?
I think first of all, we have to make a distinction between the crises we face in emerging economies and the crises we face in advanced economies right now. We have seen analogies to those crises in the emerging states and countries in the advanced already a couple of years ago, so one could learn to a certain extent out of what has happened but not being resolved yet in that very regard. And to take up another notion you've just made, I think we cannot deconnect or de-link the economic crisis from may it be a geopolitical crisis, may it be a societal crisis, may it be a technological crisis, may it be an ecological crisis as such. So every single one of those crises has its own cluster of threats again, and it's deconnected, it's connected, it's linked with each other, it's intertwined. And so it's not that easy just to reflect on the economic crisis, but we have to go further than that. Just a very quick point on debasing in Europe. Emotionally, it would play a huge role. specifically in Germany. And if it's still an anchor for so many people there when it comes to the question, do we somehow connect with the United States, yes or no? There's, of course, over here, and specifically in the administration, there are less and less young people responsible for the dossiers and other things that have ever served in Germany, so there is no connex maybe to Europe and other things. But it still plays a major role when it comes to the public, and I know that the same is true, for instance, in Italy. So I can only warn of such a step.
What's your prediction on that, Jim?
First of all, one reason that people, when they're contemplating bringing down budgets, try to be unspecific is the moment you mention something, the arguments why you shouldn't do that come up, and sometimes they're fairly compelling. I agree. Psychologically, a total withdrawal of American forces from Europe would be psychologically damaging to us as well as to Europe, particularly if you do it in the context of the moment where we're both looking weak and we need to repair our economies and so on. However, having said that, the argument that's being made by some of the critics in the United States of the current defense budget is that there is no longer a Soviet Union. There is no internal threat in Europe to start civil wars again. We are extraneous. Now, in addition to the psychological factor, though, the bases, particularly in Germany, have been useful for NATO operations, not just in Europe, but elsewhere. I would say when we get to that level of budget cutting, and we may for the defense, we should do it carefully and probably incrementally so that there aren't huge headlines. But keep in mind, we have 500,000 bases. I mean, 500 bases, excuse me, in our own country.
Even that's a lot for you.
Yeah, it sure is. And it's more than we're going to have. So there's some room for a lot of play there, if you will. A lot of smaller bases that probably can be done without. The two big bases are Europe, and then in the Far East in Japan and South Korea. And in both cases, we have been reducing troops over time, but in a way that has not caused alarm headlines. I think we ought to keep that in mind as we go forward.
Alan?
I think I'm militarily with you and emotionally with you in terms of how this kind of works. And look, when it comes to the cuts in troops, obviously we expect it to happen, the budgetary pressures along those lines, but the timing is going to be key, and the implications of what that means are key. And we must think of the following as well. When US planners are thinking about where they're cutting, strategically down the line, where is it that instability is likely to occur? Are we going to need those bases because of what's going to happen in North Africa? We've seen we're quite unclear where the Arab Spring is going to lead. Those bases may well serve a purpose. And any time you look at the strategic cuts that are proposed in any country, you have to think, well, are they actually being driven more by budgetary needs, or are they being driven more by strategic understanding? And that's the notion there. But I do want to quickly come back to the question there, the philosophical question. This is actually a key one, because we do face a challenge, to values here in terms of state capitalism versus the free market capitalism system that we've seen. And currently we're not answering it very well. Currently we're floundering with our responses. It seems that our model, which, let's be frank, has been the basis of democracy, liberty, prosperity for the last 300 years, is coming under sustained pressure because there are others in the world who have different models right now, who are doing better and who see that this may well be the path to follow. And if those countries continue to develop in the way that they have been, others may join that bandwagon in terms of the other. I think we're at quite a pivot in terms of how capitalism develops, and I think it's it's necessary for our leaders and our business leaders as well, because a lot of this is rooted in business behavior, to understand the challenge is not simply about how to restore profitability, but how to restore the values lead that we've always had over other systems as well.
It does raise the question, so let's do it here, which we're seeing the Arab Spring, about which the outcome is very unclear, and a misapprehension, I think, on the part of some that this is about democracy, which is also very unclear. And then in the West, things like the Occupy movement. Do any of you take that seriously in terms of what it represents? Go ahead.
Well, I can certainly have a go at that. I mean, I think it's interesting looking at the Occupy movement. I don't think it's a movement in the way that we've traditionally understood these things. It's, if you actually go and speak to protesters, you'll find there's a whole selection of different reasons why they're there. There isn't one overarching reason. Some people want to have a better safeguard in the system. Others want to overthrow it entirely. There's no sort of one coherent identity. But I think much more dangerous than that is the feeling on the so-called street, to coin those words, or the ordinary man, to use a horrible phrase in this sense. If you think about someone on a national average wage over the last few years, you think about the anger that's built up. Their purchasing power has gone down over the last 2-3 years. Commodity prices have risen. They can't get a mortgage, say. They can't get a loan very easily because liquidity is dried up. Everything's becoming more expensive. They may have been thrown out of work, or someone's been thrown out of work that they know. It looks very difficult for them to come back. And at the same time, they're seeing sort of largesse in financial institutions, other places. You can begin to see why there might be a notion of dangerous anger there, that while the Occupy movement is but an amorphous mass of people, there is a very real danger beneath that psychologically people's mood towards the system it has turned vitriolic as opposed to merely just angry, and they may be prepared to embrace solutions that they wouldn't have done 2-3 years ago, which will of course damage the system even more so.
Carl, Theodore, and then.
I agree with Alan. I think it's certainly a question about the mood of the people towards the system. And I went to Wall Street a couple of days ago before they somehow were disturbed, let's call it that way. It was quite a smelly place. And it was very hard to find out what the main driving force was behind the minds sitting and sleeping and doing whatever there. But the follow-up question for me is, are we already in a democracy crisis, maybe in the US, maybe in European countries as well? And in Germany, for instance, you have seen tens of thousands of people marching against a train station in Stuttgart. Could you imagine this? So and you have seen certain sceneries also in the UK when it came to the students and other things. So maybe it's a signal for a functioning democracy. But there are also some warning signals I sense behind that, and I think we should be incredibly cautious how this further develops during the next couple of months.
Jim?
Yeah, one of the points that was made earlier, I do think there is an ideological contest underway, not on a grander scale as we've had in the past, but it's not between, say, democracy and socialism. It is between different schools of thought on what capitalism ought to be and how it should be pursued. I think and I'll just leave it at that. On the occupation movement, so to speak, I think it should be taken quite seriously. And I think it's a mistake to think that to look to that for what are the specific solutions to the problems that bother them. The way to look at it, and you can see this all over America today, is that they have expanded the agenda of public concerns at the public level, which is that we have a society that's gotten too unequal, that is unfair, and that has to be addressed. How it is addressed is going to be left, I think, to political systems, we hope.
Gentleman right there.
Question that goes to something beyond the technocratic, bureaucratic side. Carl Theodore was talking about an emotional lack. Mr. Mendoza was talking about too much technocratic decisions and too much technocratic explanation for what's going on. Do you think that there has to be a cathartic moment now in relation to the depth of the European crisis, an emotional bazooka in order to bring around a profound kind of change? I've spoken to a couple of men who describe the European crisis differently than others. Jean-Pierre Juillet, who's head of the French Markets Authority, says it is a crisis resulting from a culture of connivance. Europe is associated in the minds of Europeans with little deals with cheating. I've spoken to Jean-Pierre Trichet about the same question. He said it's not a culture of connivance, it's a culture of negligence. And he aims that negligence at the hands of politicians. And my own view is that it's a culture of dispassion, where there is no emotional relationship between people and the European entity. And when there is no feeling, when there is no emotion, you can have a country like the country I live in, and very much love, France, where the loss of a AAA is taken as a catastrophe at the end of the world. In the United States, Standard & Poor's downgrades the U.S. AAA to AA and is completely forgotten about in the political area and in life in the space of 2 days. What is the catharsis that you think might be necessary? How can Europe change in some kind of profound way that makes it believable again?
Okay. Do you want to start, Carl Theodor?
John, I tried to explain that at the beginning, whether there is a cathartic moment, yes or no, it could be one. I think it is connected to the possibility or the opportunity that the general European public actually understands what's going on. And that needs certainly a kind of leadership we don't see at the very moment. So I don't know whether you see a leading politician right now in Europe who is willing and capable to deliver such emotions, who is willing and capable to really put in very short and cut sentences the main impact of what the whole idea is about and what Europe could be in the next 5 to 10 to 20 years, but not tomorrow. And we are driven by somehow by ad hoc panic decision making. And this distracts certain leaders from reaching out emotionally, but I would love to see such a cathartic moment.
And in fact, what we see is the new Italian Prime Minister appointing a cabinet that has no politicians in order to respond to a public.
Well, it's maybe part of the solution, but for a while, and for a limited amount of time, and he probably does not have much time to. I think we have to be careful and cautious, not that it turns the other way around. You do have breeding ground for populism. You do have breeding grounds for nationalism as well. And thank God, in certain European countries, we don't have talented demagogues who just take up this very solution. Then, at the end of the day,
Alan.
Well, I'm not going to disagree much with that. I mean, I think I just want to draw on a micro level. It is possible to make the case, actually, to people with confidence, with clarity. I'll take Britain's example. Look, our government came in last year stressing the need for this. It repeated it again for cuts, for the necessity to get the public finances back in order. And yes, there have been some protests and such like, but I think mostly because it was repeatedly stressed, it was repeatedly told, and it's had buy-in really from everywhere across the spectrum. They're talking about different bits about what to cut, maybe. But I think because of that, people have generally come along and said, our political leaders actually have explained this to us quite well. We're prepared to go along with it for the moment and see where it goes. So I don't think we should necessarily think the politicians can't make the argument. It's whether they can make it on a grand scale, in 17 or 27 countries at once. That's a question. But maybe it needs, actually, people to get a grip much earlier. I mean, if you look at what happened in Greece, there was, until the last minute, there was a failure from politicians to address the real issues. People had been told the gravy train would never end, and when it came to an end, they wouldn't believe it. So you have to, I think, it's about important to have realism in politics and to get the message across, even if that message is not particularly electorally palatable.
Any such thing as a catharsis, Jim? I mean, you seem to be suggesting earlier that maybe that, in your case, will be the U.S. election.
I'm not enough of an optimist to think the next election will be cathartic. I hope it will be remedial. On the point with Europe, I would just concur with what's being said, but the word I would look for, John, more than catharsis, is accountability. We have political systems both in the U.S. and here in which that is just not a major factor. And that has led to all sorts of abuses, even criminality. And I think until we can get back to a system and to a public that demands accountability, now that's tough to do when you have a democratic deficit of the size that there is in Europe at the moment.
Well, and you have the kind of responses to crisis like Sarbanes-Oxley or whatever it might be that then ends up being the cure is worse than the disease.
Okay.
All right, gentleman right here.
My name is Jack James from Washington. I wanted to raise a question about security again, since we're at the Halifax Security Forum. And we heard Panetta talk about the need for pooling resources, and that's been going on for quite a long time. if you remember the speech that Secretary Gates gave some 2-3 years ago when he talked about the demilitarization of Europe and the dangers involved in us gliding apart in terms of perception of threat, I wonder if you look ahead, and maybe taking up on John Vinocourt's point about a catharsis or a catalyst of some sort, what is it that's going to take to get a consensus at a time of austerity between the 3 C's, the commitment, the capabilities, and the cash? And I see some real danger here, particularly with the domestic forces in Europe, if Gates was right. And Carl Theodor, you may disagree on that, whether that there is a demilitarization of Europe as he seemed to think was happening. How do you counter that if that is the case? And second of all, if there's going to be that problem in Europe, how are we going to face that problem across the Atlantic? Because that could be a real danger point.
Certainly not by mutual finger pointing. This is definitely not the solution. I think there's a constant risk of a demilitarization. It's not an entire demilitarization, of course, but one that it's very much inward-looking and some are focused to the own structures as such, and more leaning towards development aid and other things. I made a point at the beginning that when I said it also offers the chance for more professional armed forces in Europe, military cuts. And that's what we try to do in Germany right now. And I do see similar developments, for instance, in Poland. They were a little bit earlier with that. So, and they are an integral part of certain missions. We are not integral part of other missions. And I saw with, let's try to find the mildest and most diplomatic word here, as a former member of cabinet, our behavior regarding Libya this year. Yeah? Let's leave it like that, because my inner feelings were a bit different to what has actually happened at that very time. So, but I think that's not too tightly linked to the question whether we are demilitarized, yes or no. It's an ongoing question whether we should take part in out-of-area missions, yes or no, although it is our direct neighborhood. And go back to one point Anne-Marie Slaughter made before, when she said the European Union could be an integral part when it comes to North Africa and other things. Well, it could be, but it certainly isn't as long as there is no sense, clear and tough and blunt European foreign policy. There is none yet, as such. It's still a state-to-state question, and the same is true for certain aspects of security. So there needs to be more cooperation. Within cooperation, there's a chance for being a better global player when it comes to armed forces and security as well.
All right, we have 4 questioners lined up, and we're just moving toward the end of this. So let's go to this gentleman. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. Martin Klings of the German weekly Die Zeit. Just a short question. Do we see also a crisis of political structure and constitutions? And do these crises ask more for more centralism? Because if you look at the European Union, there is the question of further integration and, you know, giving up more sovereignty. And if you look at the United States, from education to the healthcare system, there is a demand of more federal power. So is that also a crisis of constitution, and is centralism, more centralism, maybe the answer?
Jim, why don't you take that one on in the States first?
It's a bit more complex than that, what the debate going on in the United States, and it is generated to a great extent by the crisis that we've got now, with an economy that's sinking, with the next generation thinking it can't do as well as the last, and so forth and so on. But one of the dysfunctions of the system is a lot of people say the problem is we're too centralized, that we should go back to states' rights and a whole bunch of things, including education. And then there are those who say, no, the problem is the Madisonian system has so many checks and balances you can't get anything done. I don't know what the perfect answer is to that, but it is a problem. I don't think it's as big a problem as Europe has, because Europe has a fundamental decentralization on a key issue that I think is really plaguing. If I can go back just very briefly to when the euro was being considered but not yet had been created. We ran a number of pieces in our magazine about, listen, you can't have a common monetary policy without a fiscal policy. You're going to put people in dry dock. It took a while, but that's where we've gotten to. Now, that's a much bigger kind of problem, centralization, decentralization, than I think we face in the United States.
Alan?
Well, I think, yes, leading on from that comment, I think your key point is in Europe, the question of whether you're going to have more centralization is tied into this question of accountability and democratic approval for it. This is the whole problem we face in the last 10, 15 years. There really hasn't been political buy-in. Maybe the case wasn't made, or it didn't want to be made, or people refused to take the results when they came out in a certain way on that process. And as a result, if you're thinking of pushing for more centralization now, when we're already increasingly down that line, without getting the political buy-in to that, aren't you just repeating the problems of before? I mean, you are. You're going to continuously go down this route of a small group of people deciding, well, what we need is more centralization, ever larger numbers of people feeling dislocated as a result, and if the fix doesn't work and you have to keep on coming back to it, where does that lead you democratically? Where does that lead you to the political buy-in for your financial project? It doesn't exist, and that's the problem.
Question right here.
Stephen Chan from the School of Oriental and African Studies. I still have this concern that we're somehow looking very much only at our own navels. And I have the sense that what we're looking at is not just a crisis in capitalism, as some people would loosely call it. You've actually got a crisis in terms of competition for who controls the flow of global capitalism. And I think that we've been dismissing too easily the aspirations of other actors in the global financial and capitalist system. I think we've been too dismissive of the rise of China. I think that China is not wanting to take over the world at this moment in time. It is certainly very, very anxious to buy into strategic levers that it can use for the future. And I think that one of the watersheds that we need to look at in China is, in fact, with its own change of leadership, which will occur sometime in the very, very near future, where a new, younger, highly technocratic generation is going to assume all of the important positions, both in terms of the Communist Party and in terms of China, or with PhDs, or who went through the Cultural Revolution on the receiving end, or with a very Chinese but global view of the world. At that point in time, depending on how many levers they amass access to now, we could see some quite interesting things coming out of the Chinese equation. But I want to just leave you with the thought it's not just the Chinese. Obviously, there was a certain amount of rhetoric involved in the statement just about 36 hours ago, a certain amount of jostling for leadership of the Lusophonic community. But when you have a country like Angola offering to buy out Portugal's debt, something is changing in the global system, and we don't even see it coming.
Great. So quick comments from each of you, and also sort of on the issue of China, Chimerica or Chindia, and see where you think that was going. Alan, why don't you start?
Well, okay, and to coin a trite phrase, every crisis creates an opportunity. Now, that opportunity may not be ours in this crisis. It's China and others who see this as their chance to buy things up on the cheap, to gain their strategic levers, as has been suggested, and to use that in advance. If you look at history over time, when you saw the economic primacy shift from Europe to America, and specifically between Britain and America, you saw it through crisis in the case of world wars, in terms of how, in a sense, the financial system reacted, how the US was able to use those to its advantage in terms of leveraging its financial power for the future. And I think we'll discover 2-3 years down the line exactly how this process has worked. Now, of course, in some cases, you've seen some reactions to it. I'll give you one rather random example. In Iceland, there's been this issue of a Chinese citizen trying to buy up about 2% of Iceland, looking at this and trying to think of it strategically. It's actually caused quite an interesting stir within Iceland, which of course has had its share of financial problems. And the reaction there, though, has been, look, this actually may be a bad thing to sell, this amount of land to someone who, although he is a private individual, may have some connection, with the government. It may lead to future problems. So I think people have to start considering strategically what the nature of asking China for handouts is and moving forward in that.
Jim, comment?
Yeah, I want to address the China question because I agree very much with this gentleman in one respect. If we go back to the last great transformation of the global international system, when Germany was coming on strong and Japan was, you can say in hindsight that the system itself would not open up for these new aspirants, and the aspirants went about trying to get in the wrong way. So they both have some... We're trying to avoid that this time, and I think a proper understanding of China, at least the way they're behaving now, is that, yes, they have strong domestic interests to become a prosperous country and not to have their population explode on them. They have strong regional interests because they're the most dynamic region in the world. They got a lot of competition right there. And then on the global level, the stronger they get, the more they want to have a say. Now, that doesn't mean that they want to go to war with anybody. And I think we do have to start moving, probably more constructively than we have, on creating more voices, more buy-in for not only China, but emerging nations in the big international institutions. And that is part, it's only part of avoiding the last great transition, which turned out to be so tragic.
I'm going to ask the next, you're okay? All right, we'll go to our final question here.
Nice to be last, I guess. It's Daryl Bricker from Ipsos, a global public opinion research company. We released a survey yesterday with Security Forum. I just wanted to bring the public into this room because we talk an awful lot about institutions, but we don't talk a lot about what the public actually thinks. And the first point I want to make is that when it comes to economic confidence, actually, there's a lot of economic confidence in the world. It just doesn't happen to be in the places that we're talking about right now. If you go to China, if you go to India, even in Europe, Sweden and Germany, economic confidence is actually reasonably good. In North America here, the US is at 14, Canada's at 65. If you go to Asia or India, economic confidence is actually quite high. So there's a lot of the world that's looking at this, wondering what's going on, because the public doesn't feel engaged in it because they're not feeling the pressure that, say, somebody in the UK is feeling. So that's one point. The next point is that when it comes to this crisis in economic confidence that seems to be existing in these countries right now, the public feels that it's something that has been done to them as opposed to something that they've done. And that's the real political crisis. So the question is, how do you engage with people who feel that they've been wronged by the economic crisis that's taking place right now, as opposed to being culpable themselves? And the final point in all of this, as people, particularly in these countries that we're talking about, are saying that they're very concerned about their economies, they are disengaging with the world. What we're seeing is a direct correlation between people's economic confidence and their willingness to participate in world affairs. And some of the countries that you're from are the least interested in participating in world affairs right now.
Answer that if you can, keeping in mind that this will be more or less your final comment, and also just in the back of your heads a little bit with all this discussion about what the future looks like and whether it is Chindi or whatever. You know, who's going to be the world's leading economy in 2025? Like, how is this going to resolve itself? So we'll just, we'll have final comments from each of you. Carl, would you like to start?
I would like to ask one question to you. The survey you have just stated, it's how do you deal with a public that is somehow, that takes certain economic successes for granted? That's true for Germany. And that also raises a certain disinterest regarding those very questions. So this is, there you have to make a distinction within Europe again and how to deal with all those things. I think you have made a very important point about the future role maybe of China or of others, and specifically, as you've, Jim just pointed out as well, how do we connect it with our multinational institutions? And there we are in an urgent need of significant change. And that's not only true for the United Nations. We keep discussing this at those fora for years and years, but probably for the IMF, for the World Bank, and for others. How do they interact there? And it will be it means not talking about China. It means also talking about Brazil, about India, of course, about Indonesia after quite a while, probably. So again, what I said at the beginning, we don't have it on our screen yet from a European perspective, probably from an American perspective. It's again, a shift more over the Pacific, with Europe not sitting in any of those rooms. In the APEC meeting a couple of days ago, there was not even a European Beobachter, as we say in German. There was not even somebody observing what's happening there. So it brings me back to my pessimism from the beginning.
Mr. Hogue.
If you travel to places like Brazil, China, India, but many of you do, and I have, you cannot help but be struck today about the level of confidence they have in their abilities to command a good part of the future. It hasn't always been that way. I've been going to India for over 25 years, and it used to be the only thing you got when you went to India was the latest victimology story they wanted to tell you. Now they want you to get out of the way unless you have something to help them move forward. We've been there before. We're just not there now. And the point I would make is that kind of enthusiasm, that kind of confidence that the future, regardless of the obstacle, is going to be better, is based on some facts. And they do have roaring economies. They've got corruption, they've got cronyism, they've got all sorts of things, but at the heart of it, the economies are really moving forward. Ours are not. And it is a great shock in our country. I've got kids in their 20s to listen to them talk about what they see in the future. And what they see is not what we saw when we were their age. It's a much grimmer kind of scenario. So we've got to get our houses in order for a whole bunch of reasons, including global leadership.
Alan?
Well, I think the question shows both the strengths and the weaknesses of opinion polling. I mean, if you look at the strengths, opinion polling is a snapshot of public opinion at any one time. If you look at the weaknesses, opinion polling is a snapshot of public opinion at any one time. It's the same thing. It's a set of attitudes at one moment, looking at how people consider things right then and there. Now, obviously, if you go to the emerging economies, they're going to feel confident. You look around you, the pace of change is so dramatic, you can't help but feel uplifted, and in a much quicker way than we saw 100, 200 years ago in our economies. It's going to happen. But at the same time, look, we have reinvented ourselves constantly, time and time again. What we have to do to make sure that this continues is indeed to feed into the idea that the capitalist system that we have today is indeed the system that best leads to prosperity for everyone. If that means tinkering around the edges, if that means business leaders reacting accordingly or governments reacting accordingly to do so, then it needs to happen. And once we do that, we too can aspire to that same level of confidence. We've done it before, we can do it again.
I met a young student, a British student, who was trained at the Ivy Leagues and in America, and he was taking his business degree in Hyderabad, India. And I said, why had he chosen that? And he looked at me as if I had 3 heads and said, because this is where the future is. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Alan Mendoza, Jim Hogue, and Carl Theodor zu Guttenberg. You were brilliant. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.